Hello and welcome to the Shiny Bees podcast, a podcast for those who like their knitting, comedy and yarn in equally large measures. I'm your host Jo Milmine and this is episode 160, Dorset Buttons with Tania Ashton Jones of TJ Frog.
I feel a need to laugh again with you, if that's alright. I need a drink, I need a friend, I need your help. I want to smile again.
Hello and welcome to episode 160 of the Shiny Bees podcast. I am Jo, I'm your host, and today is the Tuesday, the 20th of October. How are you? I hope you've been well since last time I spoke to you. And as usual, a warm welcome to returning listeners. And if you're a new listener today, thank you for giving us a shot. I hope you will enjoy hanging out with us and having a listen to today's episode. And I am very excited about today's episode because I'm joined by a guest in the first time for a little while. And that guest is the awesome Tania Ashton Jones of TJ Frog. She's based up in Skye in the northwest of Scotland, and she is an expert basically on all things Dorset buttons. You've probably seen her around at shows if you've been around the shows in the UK. She's been trading for a good few years now, as you'll find out when we get into the episode. And I really enjoy Tania's attitude towards her business and keeping kind of heritage crafts alive, and also looking kind of just beyond the craft and the making into the history of some of the things that she makes, that she teaches people to make, and it's a super interesting conversation. She also has a range of yarns as well that, again, tell a story, and you know how much I love a story, basically. And Tania is a lot of fun as well. So I was really, really pleased to get Tania onto the show and to have her here with you. So I won't bang on too much because you came to listen to Tania as well. So grab your brew, grab your knitting, and we will crack on with the show. So I'm super excited today to be welcoming my dear friend Tania Ashton Jones of TJ Frog onto the show. How are you, Tania?
I'm great, thank you, Jo.
Awesome. I'm really excited to have you with us again. We recorded this interview, or not this very interview, but an interview a while back, and I completely lost the interview. So I'm really pleased that you've agreed to come back on and do an up-to-date interview, because I know you've been doing lots and lots of interesting stuff since the last time that we chatted. We've known each other quite a long time now, haven't we?
Yes, I'm trying to think how long it would be.
I think it's about 6 years.
5 years, yeah.
Because I definitely lived in Elgin. We met in Inverness at Eden Court when there was a yarn show there.
Yes, you're right. I remember I was by that beautiful stained glass window. Yes.
You were. And obviously the chat was brilliant, but I was properly mesmerised by that stained glass window. It's a beautiful venue, and Inverness is a great city. So it's cool to have a yarn show there for sure.
Yeah, I completely forgotten about that. Yeah. Time flies.
It does. And I've still got the decoration as well that I bought from you. The Dorset button decoration. It goes on my tree every year. Anyway, concentrate, Jo. You can tell it's early in the morning. I'm trying to give up caffeine. So for those people who aren't as fortunate as me to have known you for 6 years, can you please tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Okay. Well, TJ Frog is the name of my business, and TJ is Tania Jane, and the frog is a nod to my lifelong love of frogs, both the real thing and ornamental frogs as well. And I got back into knitting back in 2008 when I was due to leave the Royal Navy after 22 years. And I can't even think what sparked me off to think about knitting, because I hadn't knitted for quite a few years. I'd learnt as a child. My nana taught me to knit, and I'd done some knitting as one of my Duke of Edinburgh awards. And in my kind of 20s and 30s, I'd sort of shifted over to doing a lot of cross stitch. So yeah, I can't remember what sparked the knitting, but I thought I really want to take up some crafts again when I leave the Navy, and I want to get back into knitting. So I went on this knitting retreat in France, which was tutored by Jane Crowfoot and Debbie Abrahams. And the first night there, I was totally overwhelmed. There was people using words like intarsia and colourwork and feral and Ravelry, and I just didn't have a clue what they were talking about. And when we did the introductions, I sat there and went, "My name's Tania and I can knit one and purl one." I was just like, yeah, what's going on? And it was just a week where I was that sponge soaking up everything to do with knitting and hearing all about that world of knitting out there that I just didn't have a clue about that was going on. And that just sparked this massive interest. And I spoke to a couple of people who were doing blogs and were self-employed with work around knitting. And I'd already made the decision that I was going to go self-employed when I left the Navy, because I had kind of had all that lifetime of kind of discipline and structure and hierarchical organization. I decided I wanted the complete opposite. I wanted to go self-employed. I didn't want to be in a disciplined organization or have structure to my day. So I had this self-employed idea that I was going to carry on doing business training, which I did in the Navy. But I also had this idea, perhaps I could do a kind of craft business, and it was thinking about how I could improve my knitting skills and do something there. But in the meantime, I got involved in a knitting group when I was still living down on the south of England. And one of the ladies, Norma, invited her friend along, Maureen, to teach us Dorset buttons. And I just got hooked. And that kind of was the start of my business, my TJ Frog Dorset business. Sorry, TJ Frog Dorset button business. The business is really rooted in the whole of that heritage craft. And I think what disappointed me was that I was actually brought up in Dorset and I never learnt about Dorset buttons whilst I was at school. So I went off to the Dorset History Museum and tried to read up all about them. And yeah, just really, really got hooked in it. And so I started off on this journey of self-employment as a business trainer, and in the sort of background, I started teaching Dorset buttons at a local craft centre and doing some commissions. And then in 2014, we moved up to Skye, and I was doing less and less of my business training on the road and started to think a little bit more about what I could do around the Dorset button business. And then I saw an advert, and it was for a show, and the deadline for the applications was 2 days away. And I applied and I got a place, and it was Edinburgh Yarn Festival in 2015. And that really was the start of it all. And as they say, the rest is history.
Oh, that's awesome. It's so funny, isn't it? Because obviously, like, I didn't do 22s, but I was in the Air Force as well. So we always had that kind of thing in common. And it's quite funny how many people do decide, like, I'm just going to do whatever I want for a change.
Do the complete opposite.
Don't want any SOPs. I don't want to wear a uniform. Like, I don't want a boss. I'm just going to do what I want to do.
Exactly.
And then you find that you end up kind of creating all these little structures around you so that you still have that, but it's just you that's in charge instead.
Yes, and I think, like me, you found that those skills that you gained in the military are so transferable, and you're using those in all your aspects of your self-employment work now.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, you went from that self-employed to the Dorset buttons, and you are from Dorset originally, aren't you?
Yeah. And I think, as I say, that was sad for me that I didn't learn about it at school. But my understanding now is that there are some schools that do teach it, and some people are learning it in the brownies and guides and rangers. And yeah, I think there's a lot more knowledge out there now about the Dorset buttons, and a lot more people doing it as well. So, which is great to see.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good to have like a heritage craft, and particularly one that's got a very geographical aspect to it and a lot of history, be carried on and become more popular again.
Yes.
For people who are not that familiar with like Dorset buttons and the history of that, could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I'm sure a lot of the listeners will be really interested to hear that.
Yeah, certainly. So the Dorset button, as you say, it's classed as a heritage craft now, and it dates back to the early 1600s. And basically, it's thought that there was this guy called Abraham Case who had been over on the continent, and he'd seen some of the people, some of the soldiers wearing cloth buttons on their uniforms, and he'd come back and settled in Dorset, where there was this abundance of sheep, and set about building up this business. So the original Dorset button was a slice of sheep's horn, and if you imagine about the size of a sequin, and that would form the base of the button. And then they would have cloth, linen fabric, and they would use linen thread, and they would build up the button. So the very first buttons were called high tops, and they used this embroidered like blanket stitch would go round the linen thread. And then there was various different versions of this. We had one that was then called the Dorset knob, and there's actually Dorset knob biscuits in the shape of the Dorset knob buttons, which you can
Cool.
still buy today. Yeah, there's the Dorset knob factory in Dorset. And then eventually they moved over to using wire, and they would solder together wire to make rings. And they moved over to using the linen fabric on the rings. So a little bit like we know the buttons today that are made by the machines, the kind of pressed fabric ones. So they looked a bit similar to that, except for they were really very tiny and had these beautiful little stitches that went around the inside of the ring and lovely little French knots on top. And then they moved over to just using the linen thread. But some of these buttons, I mean, they are minute. They are kind of like about 4 millimeters in size. They really are very, very small. And some of them were used on children's clothing, on nightshirts, on dresses, on waistcoats, and very much a lot were used for, well, the best quality were used for gentry and royalty, and a lot were exported. And the people used to, it was predominantly women and children who made them, and they would make them, and then they would walk to wherever the depot was and deliver what they had made, and then they would get more materials back in exchange and go back again. And that was their routine. But of course, in 1851, the electronic button making machine made its first appearance at the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace. And then later on, with the First World War, gradually there was this sort of overall decline in the need for handmade buttons. And then obviously with the men going away to war and women's jobs being distributed differently, there was just this decline in that handmade button industry.
It's fascinating listening to all of the history of it, and you can see that you've, or rather hear that you've researched it, and you're genuinely interested in how the manufacture of these goods kind of progressed from the beginning and where they came from to what led to the decline. And I was talking a couple of episodes ago about different buttons and wartime fashion, and how the fashions changed according to what materials were available. And it went from being like 10 buttons on a cardigan to 3, and being made out of plastic rather than metal, because the metal was needed for the aircraft and all of that kind of stuff. It's really interesting to hear how kind of socioeconomic factors and political factors play into what we make and what we wear, and how that can increase an industry or lead to it declining. So it's really interesting to hear about it.
Definitely, yeah. And I think it's great that there's just been this massive revival of it as well. Certainly in the time that I've been doing it, it's become more popular. And that's always been one of my big aims, is just to kind of spread the word so that we don't lose the knowledge of this particular heritage craft. Because you can take the basic techniques that were used all those years ago and now make really beautiful, functional and decorative buttons for your own handmade projects, or to, you know, revitalize perhaps a shop bought piece that, you know, the buttons are looking a bit worn, or you want to just jazz it up a bit. So I think they're so versatile. There's so much you can do with them, and that's what I love so much. There's just, yeah, a lot you can do, and it really does give you that sort of creative license to just play with them, really.
Absolutely. And they are so, so pretty to look at. Like, so intricate. And the beads, I mean, I love a bead. Love a bead. They're just lovely to look at. And you also teach classes on this. And I know you've got some kits, because I've actually done your snowman one.
Yeah,
I had a snowman Christmas decoration that I did with the Beast. She helped me to do it.
that's right.
Yeah, so there's just loads of different ways you can use them, and it's nice when we talk about the yarn a lot, and we talk about the patterns a lot, but the buttons are like make or break for a project, I think, and they can really add to a finished object and help you to make it your own. When it's, you know, say it's a popular pattern like your Lush or whatever, just having those buttons makes it look different.
Totally. I mean, I had a cardigan that I knitted. Well, I think it was the first thing I knitted after I did that retreat in France, and it just sat there for ages gathering dust, because I couldn't. It was a variegated yarn, and I just couldn't find the right buttons. And I think a lot of us are guilty of that, where we knit this beautiful piece and then it just sits waiting for us to find the button. And after I'd started to learn how to make Dorset buttons, I was like, I can make the buttons. And actually this cardigan has got 13 little buttons on it, and I absolutely love it. And I just think, yes, you know, you always have yarn left over from a project, don't you? Mm-hmm. There's always scraps of yarn that you can use to make a button. You don't need very much yarn to produce that little thing of beauty to add to your project.
For sure. And it's a good way of using up your scraps as well, and getting your full, you know, the full amount out of, you know, whatever yarn you've bought, especially if it's a hand dyed or it's a luxury blend. You sit there thinking, I'm not done, I'm going to use this for, but it's worth about £5. You know what I mean? Just sat there. It's a good way to kind of, you know, it's going to match, put it one way.
Exactly. Or even, you know, you might have a real contrasting thing from another project that just, you know, lifts it. So yeah, it's, you can make them even with other bits of yarn that you've got left over to do a contrasting theme as well, if you want to.
Absolutely. So we know you do your Dorset buttons, and clearly very knowledgeable about that, but you've also branched into producing your own yarns as well. So can you tell us a little bit about that, and how you came to the idea of doing that, what inspired it, and what sort of things you've learned as a result of doing that?
Yes, a very steep learning
question.
In more ways than one. I think, you know, my sort of going back to the beginning of the story, my original thing was always that the business was going to be around knitting, and of course the Dorset buttons came along, and I kind of felt that I got my skill set around that quite quickly, and I could work on that quite quickly, but I still needed to build up my skill set on knitting skills and information and knowledge and yarns and wools, and that would take longer. So I think what I set out with the Dorset buttons, there was always this thing that I wanted still to do my initial idea with yarn and wool and patterns and design, and, you know, I'm still working towards that goal. So yes, the idea came that my business is very much rooted in Dorset buttons, and I therefore wanted to think about the Dorset wools. So I set about exploring about those, but I also wanted to incorporate the fact that I now live on the Isle of Skye, which is another very special place. And Skye and Dorset both have fantastic, rich geological features. They're both coastal. They've both got Jurassic coastline, and that's something that's always really interested me as well, because I studied geology some time back with the Open University. So that was a special link for me as well. And just thinking about the sheep in both places that have shaped the land over time. So I think that was the idea that was growing inside me, that I wanted to bring Skye and Dorset together, and how could I do it? And the challenge actually came to me from a friend, Caroline. She loved what I was doing with the Dorset buttons, and she was the one who initially sparked that challenge. How can you bring Dorset and Skye? How can you link the two? And that really sowed the seed for the wool that I've now got from Dorset. So for the first time this year, I've finally got all the Dorset breeds in my stock. So I initially started out with Pole Dorset from a farm in Dorset, and Hebridean from a croft on Skye. And that was my very first wool that I had produced. And as I say, that was the one that Caroline really did, spark the idea for bringing that one together. And I've had that one produced each year now, still from the same farm in Dorset and still from the same croft on Skye. So that's very special to me. The other yarns then, I've got the Dorset Down, and then I've got the Dorset Horn. And this year, for the first time, I've got Portland, which is fantastic, because both the Portland, the Down and the Horn are all classed as rare breeds. So 3 of the 4 Dorset breeds are rare. So I'm really, really happy to have those. And then the other latest one to my collection is Cheviot, and that's literally from a crofter in my little community. And the community I live in, there's only about 40 houses. There's nothing else here. It's crofting land all around. And these sheep literally sit in the field across the road from my driveway, which that's really special to have that small batch spun up this year. I think, though, the biggest challenge for me was learning about fleeces. And I probably have still very, very little knowledge on this, and I'm still really, really learning how to skirt a fleece, which bits of the fleece work and don't work, and learning all about woolen spun and worsted spun, and working with the different mills. It's been definitely a steep learning curve, and I've still got lots more to learn. All my initial yarns were worsted spun, but I've just had my latest batch of Dorset have all been woolen spun, and they literally arrived yesterday. I had 8 sacks, kilos and kilos and kilos of yarn arrived yesterday when I was out. So my very special TJ Frog staff, aka hubby, sorted all that out for me. And I haven't actually opened it up yet, because I was out most of the day yesterday and just got in. And so I'm looking forward to diving into that later to have a look at that. So it's been fascinating to do this, and I've currently got somebody designing a pattern for me, which is very exciting. I've seen the first photo, the first sort of swatch. So that's really the kind of next stage in this business progression, really, is the patterns for the wool with the buttons incorporated into some of those patterns. So getting there slowly, like all things, it always takes longer than you imagine. And I think that's been the thing with the lead-in time for getting the wool produced. It's become, as we know, far more, I don't know whether popular is the right word, but there's a lot more people now who have realised the importance of paying the farmer and the crofter a good wage for the work that they put into raising and looking after the animals. And people now are wanting that sustainable product. They're interested in the provenance, which farm has it come from. And so there's a lot more people doing that. So I think the mills have just, had this great influx of people wanting to produce their own yarns now. So yeah, the lead-in times are massive to get your yarns produced. So there's a lot of thinking ahead, kind of a year, 18 months, 2 years down the line, to make sure that you keep that flow of yarn coming through the system.
There's definitely a lot more people producing rare breed yarns and producing yarns with a decent provenance that you know where it's come from, which is obviously fantastic, especially for the knitter. I don't know how you kind of, I would have to do this. I'm a bit childish, but I would be like, right, I'm going to get that chevia and I'm going to knit a jumper and then I'm going to go to the end of the drive and wiggle my jumper at the sheep. Like, thanks, boys. Like, loving it. I can just imagine that for some reason. I might do it, actually. I might just knit one and then come to your house and come see the sheep.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a photo shoot to be had with a knitted garment with the sheep.
I love it. I love it. No, it's you can see like everything that you've done with your business and everything that you talk about as I listen to you like tell the stories behind all of this stuff. And like we love stories and love to hear about where things come from. And it just shines through how enthusiastic you are about the stories and about preserving things, but also about making something that's like pretty and usable and enjoyable for people now and to help them learn as well. It's not just a kind of consume thing. It's like, what can we learn about the geology? What can we learn about the history? What can we learn about the different breeds? It's just very nice to have that whole background story to it as well, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's trying for me all the time to just think how I can keep building that and sort of pushing the boundaries, but always still linking it back to Dorset, the place, the history, and also, as I say, to where I live now and how I can incorporate that in. And I think that was another factor when I thought about the project and sort of needle bags and notion bags that I do, because I wanted to have something that represented the fabric of the time, and the linen fabric was what was used in the original Dorset buttons. Mm-hmm. And that's the fabric that makes up my project bags. So all of those project bags, I make all the buttons myself, and then either myself or my TJ Frog staff photograph them, and then that gets printed onto linen and gets made into project bags for me by a social enterprise, Colopsia in Edinburgh.
See, it's super cool. Like, I totally, like, tangent warning. I went shopping in the Trafford Centre yesterday and, like, they had some nice stuff in, but every time you pick up, you're like, oh, that's nice. Oh, it's actually made out of wool. Oh, it's made in China. Oh, it's made in China. And I refuse to buy anything made in China. So you just don't get that. And then you hear like you're doing this work where it's like, and this is the story, and that person does this, and that benefits them, and that creates opportunity here, and that, gives the farmer a fair wage. And at the end of it, you've got something beautiful that people want as well. I just think it's really important. And I just wish it was easier to find people who were doing this kind of really creative, but very positive and, good and happy feeling work. So you could just go and spend all your money with them in one place.
Yeah, I think, the difficulty is it does take time to build up and to find people to support you and to just seek out all the resources to put your ideas together as well. I mean, me and sewing machines are not very compatible. And so I always thought that I would have to get somebody else to make the project bags for me, although I still aspire maybe one day I might get more friendly with a sewing machine. And again, it was just then important that how do I get somebody to do that? Who do I get? And I was very fortunate to find Colopsia in the early years of their production. And so I've been working with them for quite some time now, and at the time the fabric was printed by a lovely company called Be Fab Be Creative, also in Edinburgh. Sadly, they closed down earlier this year, actually, not as a result of the pandemic, but just before the pandemic. And it's lovely again to support other independent businesses within my business, really.
Absolutely. So you've talked obviously quite a lot about Dorset, and you've talked about Skye and how your products tie those two places together, and a lot of the stories behind that. But it's very clear that you're also very passionate about supporting other businesses and kind of how that, it links into your story as well. But you have a podcast, Tania, about Skye. And we like podcasts because this is a podcast. So tell us a bit about your podcast and why you started it and what it's about. And yeah.
Well, it was really listening to people like yourself and Louise. We'll work, Louise, and Louise, Caithness Craft Collective. It just started to think, maybe I could do this. And I think I was linking back again to those skills of being a trainer and used to just talking and and I thought, let's have a go at this. I wasn't really feeling that I wanted to do a video type thing, and so the audio really appealed to me. And one day I just looked online and thought, wow, what's the best thing I can do? How do I go about doing this? And I found that there was already free software on my Apple Mac laptop. And I think I read somewhere that, if you're going to spend any money, then try and get the best microphone that you can afford. And that was all I spent the money on. And then I came up with this little format, which has pretty much followed. Yeah, it's been the same since I started. It probably is at a stage where it needs a little refresh. And so I fundamentally talk about a handful of things. And the first up is the weather. Love talking about the weather. And I just, since I've moved to Skye, I've become more and more fascinated with it. I always say, I live in and around the Skye as well as on Skye, because it just seems so vast here. And where I live, you can see the horizon. And it's just made me feel so much more connected to the weather in all aspects. And the weather changes frequently here. And I just am fascinated by it and can just sit and watch it all day. So I very much wanted to just talk about the weather. And I know, there are parts of the world that have very extreme weathers, very extreme, so that's not something we necessarily have here. But I just wanted to bring a little bit of what happens on Skye and put that out there. And so, I talk about the weather, and really a lot of other things have started to creep into that. So talking about the fauna and flora that we get around here and the changing seasons, because again, I'm very much more attuned to that here, seeing when the bluebells come out and the gorse and the foxgloves and the bracken, which if anybody does listen in, they'll know about my love-hate relationship with bracken, and I'm just so much more in tune with those things. So I wanted to talk about that. I talk about what I'm making, so what's on my needles and anything generally about my knitting and creativity. Talk about my Dorset buttons, so really what's happening in the business there. And then I have two little other bits on Skye. I have something called the Local Lowdown, which tends to just be a little snippet about something on Skye, and it can be anything from the co-op being renovated to
love the co-op
to a new gin that's just been produced, and everyone who listens in will know that I'm a bit of a gin lover as well. So that's which yes, Joe. So that's just a little snippet, because I do get a lot of listeners who actually have either been to Skye or they want to visit Skye one day. So they, I get feedback that they like hearing those little snippets. And then the last part is, like yourself, I do interviews with people on Sky, and I call that the Sky Showcase. And I tend to visit people at their homes or their studios or galleries, predominantly people working in textiles, but I, occasionally speak to other creative people. And then from time to time, when I've been away, maybe doing a retreat or something, I will do an interview with somebody. So I call that Across the Bridge, because that's me having sort of gone across the bridge onto the mainland. But yeah, I love the podcast. I love doing it. It's and I'm always amazed when I'm at yarn festivals, the people who come up to me and say, I listen to your podcast. And it just always seems very strange to me that people do actually listen to me on about goodness knows what.
No, but it is one of those things that it's quite often one of the distinguishing features of a podcast is commentary about where you are. And like you said, we're always banging on about the weather as Brits, like it is hoofing down here. That's the first thing we spoke about when we got on Zoom, was that it was dreadfully grey up north. I mean, what a shocker. And dark, and it is almost a way of armchair traveling with people. Like I love hearing about people's travels on podcasts and where they've been. So, and I have been to Skye, but it's nice to be able to enjoy a bit more of the local aspects of things via a podcast. It's really cool.
Yes, no, I love it. It's it's opened up lots of avenues and doors for me, and I've met some great interesting people as well through doing the interviews, and it just keeps me on my toes to think about what's happening on the island as well. And it also is a little bit of accountability for my making, or not, as the case may be.
Oh gosh, yeah, definitely. So if people want to come and find out some more about you and find your Dorset buttons and find the podcast and the yarn and everything else, TJ, where's the best place to come and look for you?
Okay, I have a website which is tjfrog.co.uk, and then I'm on Instagram and Facebook as TJ Frog Sky, and I'm on Twitter as TJ Frog Makes, and yeah, that's where you can catch up with me.
Brilliant. So I'll put links to all of that in the show notes for this episode, so people can come and click through to that as well to find it quite easily. And you also have a gift for the listeners of the podcast.
Oh, yes. For the listeners of the podcast then, up until the 10th of November, there is a 10% discount on offer across all my products on the website. So all the Dorset button kits, the yarn, the bags we mentioned, and there's also some new postcards and colouring cards we didn't mention. But yeah, there's lots of things on there that might appeal to you. So the code to put in, all in capitals, is ShinyBees10.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That is extremely kind of you. And we can all make our Cheviot jumpers now and then come visit the sheep at your house with the gin. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your stories and all of the history of the Dorset buttons with us. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's been lovely. I've really enjoyed talking about it, and you've got me all enthused and geared up for the rest of the day to get back to work.
I literally don't know how you've not opened that bag and taken a massive sniff of that yarn. So there we go. Did you enjoy that chat with Tania? She's an absolute flipping superstar and lots of fun. And I do definitely recommend, if you haven't listened to her podcast, that you head over there and have a shufty and get to meet some of the local businesses over on Skye and hang out with Tania a bit. She's really good fun. And definitely head over to her website and take advantage of that cheeky wee discount. We had some of I mentioned it earlier in the episode, but we had a couple of kits for the Dorset button snowmen that I did with the bees last year, and she absolutely loved it. The instructions are easy enough that a kid can follow them, and it's not so fiddly that a kiddie can't do them. She was 8 at that point, so she's fairly crafty, but she, it was definitely possible for her, and certainly with a little bit of grown-up help, definitely possible to do. It's half term next week. You're going to need something to do. We're all locked up again. Well, we're locked up on tier 3 in Lancashire, loving life. So definitely head over there and take a look. And a huge thank you to my lovely pal Tania for spending the time with us. So that's all we've got time for this week. I hope you have enjoyed hanging out with us. Do head over to the show notes where you can find links to everything in this episode. It's shinybees.com/160. And don't forget, we will be chatting all about this episode over in the Shiny Bees podcast community. It's free to join, and you can find that at shinybees.com/community. So have a lovely week. Happy crafting, and I will speak to you all again soon. Cheers! You've been listening to the Shiny Bees podcast. If you've enjoyed today's episode, I would love it if you would head over to your podcatcher of choice and leave a review for the podcast.
Touch with you, if that's all